Welcome back to part 3 of chapter 11. So we will pick up at slaves and slavery and the law. So it's important for you guys to remember, in order to really understand slavery, you have to understand that it's in its essence, it's completely inhumane. Okay? Enslaved people were seen as property, not as people, but as property. And because they were property, they could be bought, they could be sold, they could be leased, they could be gifted, they could be inherited. So if someone died, you could say in your will, I want my slaves to go to my next of kin. Okay, they can be inherited. They could be leased out, for example, to other plantations. So if someone needed some work done, they could say, I'm going to send someone out and you're going to do the work for this other plantation owner. Enslaved people could not testify against whites. They couldn't even hold meetings unless a white person was present, meaning they couldn't even hold church unless a white person is present. Now, another question that people often ask is, why do you think they couldn't hold church unless there was a white person present? That's to ensure that the theology that they're teaching is on, I would say, on par with what they have been teaching. Because again, a lot of what they are told, at this time, religion, specifically Christianity, is used against enslaved people as a means of control. And so instead, they want to make sure that they're not teaching any sort of liberation theology. You don't want these enslaved people to see themselves or to see these similarities between their situation and the Israelites, because the Israelites were led out of slavery, right? So you want to make sure that doesn't happen, okay? Because it goes against that theology. In the same way, it was also prohibited or forbidden for enslaved people to learn how to read or write. Okay, you cannot learn how to read or write. Now, to drive home the idea or the notion that these people were property, I'll give an example of a court case known as the state of Missouri versus Celia, a slave. This court case takes place in 1855. So Celia was bought by this slave owner at the age of 14, and the slave owner begins raping her. I use the term rape because when you don't have any power, you cannot consent, right? Slave women could not say no to the sexual advances of slave owners. And slave owners had no reason to not engage in these practices with these women that they owned, because if these women got pregnant, they were they added to their plantation population, because slavery, or the status of slave, is something that is inherited. And if the mother was enslaved, any children that she had would also be enslaved, because the status of slave was inherited. So Celia was bought at the age of 14. She bore 2 of her rapist children. She went to the owner's daughters and really tried to plead to them. She told the daughters about what their father was doing and asked them to help in stopping these repeated rapes. But they didn't. They did not do anything to stop their father from raping her. And so one night when he comes to the quarters to try to rape her again, she beat him to death with a stick, and she burned his body. Okay? Now, while Missouri law at that time declared rape illegal, in the case of enslaved women, it was not illegal, because you could do whatever you wanted to do with your enslaved property. So Celia was convicted of first-degree murder. However, Celia was pregnant at the time. And so while she was found guilty, she was sentenced to death, but they stayed the execution long enough for her to have a baby so the slave owner's descendants wouldn't lose out on any other slave property. However, the baby was stillborn, so they're not able to gain any more wealth or money from her particularly. But Celia is eventually put to death after and only after she gives birth to this child. So let's talk a little bit about the conditions of slave life. So a lot of the time, enslaved people would supplement the food that owners provided them by crops that they raised themselves, crops that they grew themselves. The plantation was a system of labor, of sunup to sundown labor, with a brief interruption during the day for meals. If you didn't, work on a plantation, they would cut wood for steamboats. They worked in mines. They manned docks. They laid down railroad track, for example. Slaves were subject to brutality. They were subject to physical punishment, but the majority of enslaved people, especially in the Deep South, worked in the field. So it just depends on where you were. It really depends on the crop that you worked on. So in the Deep South, in areas of South Carolina, in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, areas also of Arkansas and Louisiana. And though Texas is not considered the Deep South, areas of Texas as well had lots of cotton. That was the crop that brought them a lot of wealth, cotton. In Louisiana, especially southeastern Louisiana, there was a bit of sugarcane that enslaved persons would work on sugarcane plantations. Rice was really a crop that was around like the South Carolina and Georgia, like the Sea Islands and the coast. Those were the areas that grew rice. And tobacco was a crop that was grown in like Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, and even in some areas of Missouri. The slave family, slave culture also really centered around the family. Most of them married. However, a lot of the time, if they weren't sold off, these marriages would often last a lifetime. Now, in slave communities, extended kinship relations were incredibly important. Again, in the slave community, having extended kinship relations were incredibly important because you needed to know, the parents, the children, anyone could be sold off at any time. So it was important to develop relationships beyond your own bloodline in order to have these ties, in order to have family, because you're a nuclear family, your immediate family, there was no guarantee that you would be able to remain together. With the gender roles in slavery, there was an equality of powerlessness. Both men and women picked cotton. Both men and women worked in the fields. Men couldn't protect their wives, right? There was not this gender role where it was the job of the man to protect his wife because there was a powerlessness. So men could not protect their wives. Women did not get to experience a cult of domesticity. They didn't get to do these things because they didn't have any control. They did not have any power. Now, a lot of slaves, as far as religion, a lot of them will turn to Christianity. Now, while they could not gather without a white person present, they would often try to gather secretly, have services at night under the cover of darkness, and often there would be at least one person who would serve as a minister or a preacher. It offered a means of religion offered a means of social control, because often they were required to attend white services or ministers would again tell them to obey their masters, because the Bible says that you are to obey your masters as you would obey God. And they would also preach of this very dark and benighted Africa. So the place that you come from is dark. The place that you come from is bad. That also reeks of paternalism, because in your very being, in your core, you are bad. You are not good. And so everything that we're doing is for you, is for your own good. And so you see paternalism also come through that. Now, there was slaves or enslaved people would often resist. Now, it wasn't always these full-on revolts, though I will talk about two particular revolts, or two particular people who led revolts, but not all of it. You know, it wasn't always this big revolt. A lot of the times they would participate in what your book calls silent sabotage. So silent sabotage is when they would perform poor work, or they would break tools or maim or abuse the animals just to disrupt the plantation routine. So you can't work if you don't have tools, if all of your tools are broken, right? You can't, or if you don't pick a certain amount of cotton, they're not able to fetch as much money if they don't have as much product. So they would engage in silent sabotage and breaking tools. And the beast of burden is, his leg is hurting, so he can't do the work. He can't pull the plow. And they would simply disrupt the plantation routine. These are ways that they would participate in what is called silent sabotage. Now, while some enslaved people will run away, most of those who will run will be young men. And in the Deep South, in order to leave, a lot of them would try to hide in plain sight. They would fake papers that said, I have permission, or I'm going to this other plantation, right? Now, the Underground Railroad, this is something that a number of you guys have heard of already. It was a loose organization of sympathetic abolitionists who hid fugitive slaves in their homes, and they would send them on to the next station or the next home of an abolitionist. One of the most famous conductors of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was famous in that she never lost a passenger. So she made several trips. She escaped herself and then made several trips back to the Deep South and was neither caught herself or got anyone else caught. Now, she often brought a gun with her, and students are like, I always ask my students, why do you think she brought a gun? And everyone raises their hands and say, well, she brought the gun obviously for protection, so if she saw someone that she could shoot them. And I was like, yes and no, right? So slave catchers were never alone, right? It's usually more than one slave catcher, and it's only one of you with a gun. So it's like if you start a gunfight, it would be very difficult to finish that gunfight and be successful. The gun wasn't necessarily for slave catchers. It was for people who might try to turn back, okay? If you turn back, if you threaten to turn back, she would say, I'll shoot you. I'll have to kill you if you turn back. Because if they were to go back to that plantation, they are going to tell under threat or real physical brutality, you're going to tell. And it would lead to the other people in the railroad. So once you decided to run, there was no turning back with Harriet Tubman. Now, I mentioned some slave revolts. So the first one we'll talk about is Nat Turner. Nat Turner was born in 1800 in Southampton County, Virginia. And he was known as a preacher on the plantation the plantation where he worked and lived. And he was really known as a prophet of the people. He believed that God had chosen him to lead an uprising, to lead his people out of slavery. So in August 1831, he and his band of people will march to farms, and they will kill the white inhabitants of this farm. At the end of this revolt, at the end of Nat Turner's revolt, about 60 whites were killed, and there was a lot of hysteria. A mob of whites will, in response to the 60 people who have been killed, will go out and kill more than 200 black people. Nat Turner is eventually caught, and he is hanged. He is killed. As for his, I would say, his part, or for his inspiring this revolution. Another slave revolt that your book mentions is the revolt of Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey's plan doesn't fully go through like Nat Turner's does. Nat Turner has a full-on revolt, and it goes through. Denmark Vesey in 1799 was able to purchase his freedom. And so his plan after purchasing his freedom was to go back and purchase the freedom of his wife and his children. However, he's not able to do that. He's not able to purchase their freedom. So in 1822, he plans a rebellion where he wanted black people to arm themselves, and he wanted them to set fire to locations all around the city of Charleston and occupy the city. However, it doesn't get that far because those who are involved, some people learn about the plan, and they snitch. And so he's tried, he is found guilty, and in the summer of 1822, Denmark Vesey and 34 others are hanged for this rebellion. So this is the end of the chapter, but you guys have an assignment. You have multiple assignments in Module 11, but you have an assignment. So there is a link that's in the PowerPoint, but it is also on your, it's also on D2L, okay? So go to it's also on your online learning platform, just in case I teach this somewhere else. So it's also on your online platform. So I have an interview from the Library of Congress. So the Works Progress Administration I'll say in like the 30s and the 40s, they tracked down a number of formerly enslaved people in the 1930s and 40s. They tracked down a number of formerly enslaved people, and they conduct interviews. Some of these interviews are recorded, like the one that you will have. Others are given on transcript. There's a transcript of a number of interviews. And so I want you to listen to this particular interview. The man being interviewed, his name is Fountain Hughes. And he will give his experience being an enslaved person. And so I have an assignment where you'll be answering a number of questions based on that interview, and you'll be submitting that as part of one of your assignments for Module 11. So please look through the link, listen to it in its entirety, and tell me what you think. You know, if you have any questions about the interview, if you have any questions about this module at all, shoot me an email. I try to make sure the emails, especially when you have questions, are as detailed as possible, okay? All right, you guys, I will see you next week with Module 12.